Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel and thanks for watching. Today we are going to be dressing up the motor so it's almost ready for install. There were a couple of things that I wasn't able to get done because I'm waiting on my steam pipe kit, but hopefully next video this will go into the car. We did get the alternator installed, we got the electric water pump, manifold and pipework installed, we got the ITBs installed, the drive-by-wire throttle actuator, the injectors, and we also painted and insulated the fuel tanks. So look, let's have a look over those things. If you have any questions, tips, comments, or there's something you want me to cover in more depth, by all means, please leave a comment down below. Otherwise, enjoy watching it, and thanks for watching. Just while I'm here, I thought I'd run over the manifold that I've made up here out of AN fittings. We can see we've got 200 series braided hose in the center here between each of them. Now, I'm not going to show you how to make these. The main reason, in this video anyhow, the main reason being is that these are made of AN4 size fittings, or -4 if you want to call it that. The biggest issue is that this was really a pain in the ass to work with. It's quite small hose, and it was really fiddly, and it was taking me, ages to put these together, mainly just because there was absolutely no room to play with. What I will show you though is how to actually put them together when I use AN10 fittings or -10, which is much larger. The difference between 100 series hose is generally they're a push lock fitting, which means they just push on here and then you just tighten these over, whereas 200 series have a higher burst pressure and use this olive type system to put them together. What lots of guys will use on ITBs are just sort of nylon or Teflon hose that pushes into these types of fittings. It reminds me of a bloody domestic fish tank, which means that I couldn't deal with it. I thought it was a really sort of budget solution for something that's quite an expensive or high-end type of arrangement. I mean, keeping in mind that ITBs are not cheap, even the cheapest versions of them. So I wouldn't do that. The only other way that I was ever going to attack this was to do basically buy a brake line bender, CNC myself up a manifold block, and then run hard line through to that manifold block and put it together as if it was like a braking system. I went down this road. I don't know why. I got excited with AN fittings at one point. Keep in mind, just this manifold on one side is about 250 bucks worth of fittings and hose. So you're looking at about 500 bucks, whereas using these crappy things is about 300. So I don't really see the value in doing that. I know it is an extra 200 bucks, but when you've paid 7,000 bucks or $4,000 or $5,000 for other motors for ITBs, I just don't see the value in doing that or cheaping out on this type of thing. I think this will look quite good. Obviously doing a brake line bending type setup would be another way to do it. The one thing to be, I guess, conscious of with this is that you can cut it with an angle grinder, just tape the cuts and cut through. I prefer to use this because of the amount of debris that it creates. In any case, this hose doesn't always come clean. I noticed even just on this AN10 stuff that I'll be using for my oil cooler, it is a bit dirty there at the end, if I can see. So I would be running at minimum just some, don't use brake cleaner because it tends to destroy everything, but probably just use some wax and grease remover in a pressurized can if you can, and then blow it out with compressed air. That's sort of the way that I've been attacking that. Other than that, they're not sort of too hard to deal with. Don't be scared of using these. The reason that they're called AN fittings is Army and Navy, and they're designed to be pretty much foolproof. So once you get your head around how to put them together, they're not too difficult and pretty repeatable, and they look quite nice. Okay, so here's our engine with one bank of ITBs removed. And we can see the 4 ports here, 1, 2, 3, and the 4th in my cup of tea there. And we're going to be plumbing all of those together into a manifold and connecting them to a map sensor. And then on this end, we're going to be running it through to an idle air control valve, which enables us to bypass the air from the throttle bodies into the cylinders when we're at idle. With the butterflies completely closed, obviously we'll stall the engine if we don't provide some air. And then on this side, we're going to be doing the exact same thing and running it to another map sensor. Now, the reason we run dual map sensors is because it gives us a good idea of how we're balanced across both of the banks in terms of the pressure requirement or the load on each bank and how each cylinder is performing. But it also enables us to get sort of cancel out all of the inherent pulses that we get back through the manifold. It gives us a funny map reading if we were to just try and use one port. The reason that it doesn't happen on a normal engine and you can just run a single map sensor if you don't have ITBs is because you have a relatively large volume and your throttle body is actually quite a way away from the cylinder itself. So you're not going to run into issues with having all of these pulses bouncing back through your manifold and giving you map readings that are bouncing up and down, which means that you're not going to be able to know what the actual engine load is. Now, when you tune one of these, what we do is we do a combination of using manifold air pressure or MAP, and also using alpha N or throttle position to tune the fueling into the motor. There's a bit of an art to it, and we'll run through it when I actually tune this thing, but needless to say, it's basically the reason that we're running a manifold here, and we're also running an idle air control valve, which enables just simpler idle control of these engines. You can actually obviously set idle just by simply allowing or tuning each butterfly using a vacuum gauge to be slightly open at idle, which will allow enough air to bypass to get it idle smoothly. But what that doesn't account for is stuff like barometric correction, or air density, or a whole heap of other things that just doing the mechanical version of this would have its inherent drawbacks on. So that's why we're using an idle air control valve. It is used on stuff like E46 M3s or R34 GTRs or any OEM type application that runs an ITB, and that's for good reason. It's for all those other things. They need to work across a range of conditions and not just work at a single point. If you remember old dual Weber ITB setups like you'd see on AC Cobras and a whole heap of other stuff, that is part of the reason why people will say that they have very poor characteristics in terms of drivability or manners, is stuff like this. The other thing is also not being able to, with a mechanical linkage rather than a drive-by-wire setup, being able to actually tune your throttle opening to correspond with your pedal position. What these tend to work at is they're pretty much an on-off switch in a mechanical setup, whereas with this we can get them, if you tune well, to drive very happily. 30% open, 30% position on your throttle can mean 30% airflow, as distinct from 30% butterfly opening. Because you'll find with these, it's not a linear relationship. Sort of by the time you get to about 40% throttle opening on these butterflies, you're looking at like 80 or 90% of the airflow into the cylinder. So when you snap that final amount of throttle opening, it really doesn't do too much in terms of the butterfly relative to the amount of air that you're moving into the motor. Right, so obviously cleanliness is next to godliness in this sense, and I'm not going to show you the hours and hours of me cleaning stuff, but you can see this surface here is obviously you want to be as clean as possible. Whenever you are cleaning up any sort of gasketed surface, you want to avoid using anything that's sharp that could score it, or also using an abrasive wheel or any sort of mechanical type thing, because you'll have high and low spots. It's not so much of a drum with these, because these ITBs actually use a little rubber gasket, or O-ring. This is actually starting to be a more popular option. We'll also see this on our oil, our pickup for our oil cooler, and also our oil accumulator. They're just really good because they're reusable. They come on and off very quickly, and they don't leave any crap on the surface, which means that if you do have to service the sort of connection point, it's not going to be a major drama. We can see here that the ports are obviously CNC'd, and they're looking very nice in there. We just want to make sure no crap gets in there before we assemble the ITBs, and that's why obviously I've taped all this stuff off up until now using masking tape, which is actually a bit of a terrible decision. You're better off using stuff like this painter's blue tape, because it leaves a whole lot less residue and isn't so much of a pain to clean up. But we'll now get that stuff all installed, and we won't get to see any of that nice CNC porting anymore, hopefully, but it is there nonetheless, and you can see sort of the improvement there to airflow that it would have in terms of smoothing out everything and making sure there's no rough edges. Right, now those ITBs are installed, we need to get the drive-by-wire throttle actuator in place. You can see that this basically sits in the center of the valley there and has an arm that pushes against each of the linkages to open up both banks of throttle bodies. So we'll get that installed. The other thing we need to do is install the injectors, which will require us to just make sure that we've got the right length injector between the rail, or use a spacer that's appropriate for it. In this case, it's just LS3 short injectors work on this. We'll also be installing the throttle position sensor, which tells us how open the butterflies are or closed as a feedback mechanism to the ECU. You can see that that's just keyed there, and it just goes on the end of this throttle, the throttle body actuating linkage, and I can even put this in place now maybe. And then we just calibrate that in the ECU once we're ready to go. Put the shakes here. There, so that's it in place. Only took 10 minutes. Now, presumably because I've cheaped out on these heads and the ITB setup, you can see here that the drive-by-wire actuator actually just fouls on its mounting blocks at the rear here. So I'm going to have to file off just a little bit of those mounts so I can get it to sit flush. I think you'll agree that the whole sort of manifolding there has actually turned out pretty nice. I know it is expensive, but it's just one of those things. There's no point spending this much money on a set of ITBs to then be a tight ass about that manifolding. So I think that's going to look quite good in the end, but unfortunately we have to file something off something that really should just fit. But it's probably just a combination of you know, maybe some just minor differences with these Higgins race heads versus standard LS heads. The casting might just be slightly different or something like that, which means that the space between the two valleys here is just slightly different. Anyhow, what we'll do is we'll get that done, and that should square that away. So just to give you an idea about how this ITB actuator works, is you've got your step motor in here, and what it will do is it will just rotate there, and you'll see all the butterflies open up in unison. Because this has an idle air control valve, it's not as important to balance all of these butterflies, so that's going to be mounted just up the back there. If we can see that one there. We're going to plumb in both banks into this idle air control valve, and that will feed back into the airbox so that it can bypass these throttle bodies and deliver out of the engine when it's sitting at idle. The other thing which I mucked around here a bit with after I mounted the actuator there in the center is you can see here I've just got a couple of zip tie clips that I've actually just mounted onto the bottom of the drive-by-wire actuator mount. That just means that when I run all the cabling for the injectors and also for the idle air control valve, this drive-by-wire throttle, and also the two map sensors up the front here, that I'll be able to just have all that neatly and pretty well concealed, and it won't detract from the way that it looks. Here's my dodgy 3D print, which didn't work out because I broke the machine, but what we're going to have is we'll have that basically mounted up there. The cutouts here are to feed the wiring loom through, and then we'll have a couple of map sensors, as I mentioned before, one for each bank, just mounted on top of this bracket that will use the factory retaining bolts for the push rod cover plate there, and we'll feed everything back through there, and that should be quite neat. Here's the alternator setup that we've got on the LS. It's a low mount like you'd see in most Corvettes. But these principles will apply almost regardless of any engine that you're running on your car, even whether it's running a serpentine type setup where you're running, you know, power steering pumps and aircon compressors, or whether it's quite a simple setup like we've got here. Now there's two things that we need to look at here. One is aligning the pulleys, and two is tensioning the belt. Now, one thing that is, I guess, critical in this sense is making sure that you have relatively sort of correctly offset pulleys, because otherwise your belt will basically slip off or start to chew itself to pieces. The way that I've found sort of most effective to do this is basically just to mount your compressor as you your alternator in this case as you normally would, and you can shim this using washers or whatever you'd like. Or what you can do in a better sense is just use a straight edge, measure between here and the face of the pulley, or where the face of the belt would be, and then put an appropriate spacer in. That's what we'll be doing here. Yes, I could use washers, but it's not as quite of an elegant of a solution. And then what we'll be using is just a set of eye bolts here on just opposing threads, and we can just wind those out to get some tension on the alternator here. We'll mount that eye bolt up to there and mount it up to the bottom of the alternator there. Once we have that all in position and we sort of get an idea of the travel of this, we'll be able to measure our belt so we can go and get that ordered. The one thing that we did run into an issue with this is that this doesn't actually fit the appropriate bolt size, so we'll just need to drill that out quickly, but that's not the end of the world. The only other thing which is often misunderstood when you are talking about belts, or whether you're going to get appropriate drive out of a belt to the apparatus that you're trying to run, is that people think that just adding tension to the belt is going to solve all their problems. Belts are designed to run at sort of a particular tension. It's not advisable just to keep tensioning them to try and get drive out of them, because what will happen is that you'll be loading these bearings unfairly or loading your crank unfairly. So the thing that dictates it really is going to be the contact patch that you have between your pulley and your belt, and that's why it's important to make sure that you have appropriate sort of idler pulleys or whatever for the device that you're running. In this case, we're going to have, you know, pretty much more than 100, or probably about 150, 160 degrees worth of contact on this pulley here, and get it driven off the crank directly. That should be more than adequate for this, but if you are running into issues with that, running an idler pulley, for example, can increase the contact patch on a particular driven apparatus, which will help transfer that power without, you know, adding unnecessary tension. Right, most early LS motors, you can see here that there's a takeoff here, and that's for the factory oil cooler. So what we've got is we've got an adapter that's going to allow us to run that, and we're also going to be tapping into that feed to our oil cooler to run our oil accumulator or AccuSump, which I've spoken about in some earlier videos. This adapter also gives us the opportunity to put in an oil pressure and temperature sensor. That's a 2-in-1 Bosch sensor that they produce now. They also use pretty much the exact same thing for their water side or a number of other things. It's just nice that they integrate 2 sensors into one. Obviously you just have a 4-pin plug instead of a 3-pin, and it's a lot neater install. So we'll get that installed, and obviously we'll leave that in place so that then we can work out how we're going to route our AN lines once we dry fit this engine. Okay, so we're just going to prep the fuel tanks here by painting them. The main reason for that is for aesthetics. The other reason is that it will potentially help them with a little bit of heat control. The one thing that you need to be aware of with that is just that if you are in fact getting some heat into your fuel, you will obviously want to get that heat out. So this leading edge here is actually going to be exposed to the side scooping and have quite cool air over it. So we don't want to get that too well insulated. On the top and back side that faces the motor, we will be wrapping it in heat-proof insulation with a foil face. So that's what we'll be doing there. I've just got some sandpaper here which will be used to abrade the surface so that the basically the body undercoat type liner will adhere better to it. The reason that you do that is when you abrade the surface, what you're effectively doing is increasing the surface area that the paint has the ability to bond to, and also its sort of jagged face gives it a bit better grip type surface. What I'll be using to spray is just a standard underbody spray gun. These things are like 30 bucks. So if you've never had any experience spray painting, I'm not the wizard at it. It's not a bad way to start out or get a feel for it. Obviously make sure you use wax and grease remover after you abrade the surface to make sure that you've got rid of all the dust and stuff that would prevent the paint from bonding. And here's our finished fuel tank. We can see here that the bully liner turned out quite nice as a finish. It's certainly pretty robust and easy to repair if you need to. And all the insulation is going to be towards the engine side. We've also got the fuel sender here. This is a VDO item. There it is there. And we can see that that's just going to bolt down to the top of the tank here. You have one on each tank, and that will feed back to our dash or via the ECU to display how much fuel we've got left. There's a crossover pipe here, and I'll explain the whole fuel system with its swirl pot and low pressure pump and high pressure pump and all that sort of stuff once we plumb that in shortly. So there it is. The fuel tanks look like they turned out okay. That's its counterpart installed on the other side there. So we can see that that's not going to be too bad, and it's going to look quite nice in that position. Right, one of the showstoppers for getting this engine finished off was just the steam pipe kit. Now what LS engines have is at the front of each of the heads and at the rear in a similar position is they have these vent points, and the reason that they have those is you can see here that the water galleries for the water pump are actually below the height of the top of the head. So you can have trapped air in here that builds up especially over time, and then you can end up with hot spots in the head which cause overheating issues and potentially valve train issues. So what they do is they provide these 4 points to relieve it and return that to the top of the radiator or whatever, just to ensure that you're not running into any dramas with that. It isn't something that I was actually particularly familiar with, which is why I hadn't already ordered it. There's really only one manufacturer of these kits that I sort of prefer, and that's Motion Raceworks. It's a hardline kit. It uses all AN fittings and is going to look pretty neat in there. So look, I'll run over that once I get that, but unfortunately it's just a bit of a pain. It means that I can't get this motor off its engine stand, and this engine stand conveniently means that I can't fit up the headers because it fouls on it, and I also can't fit up the rear adapter plate or the clutch or the bell housing or any of that stuff. So it's a bit of a pain, but it's just something we're going to deal with, and hopefully we should be well and truly on our way by the time we just get this minor piece of gear. So just as a quick adjoinder to that comment about the steam pipe setup that we've got on the LS, we can see here on this particular motor that the coolant galleries in your head are going to be considerably lower than the actual discharge point for your thermostat in this case. The coolant passages on these ones pass up through the inlet manifold, and you flow out through the thermostat there. So that's just why on this particular motor you wouldn't require a steam pipe kit. On the LS you do. On LTs I don't believe that they retain that setup. The water neck on the LS is obviously sort of coming out at a lower point there. So logically hot air rises, or any air rises to the top of a fluid, and even in the best cooling systems you still do have some bubbles that are going to precipitate out of the fluid. It's why you actually have swirl pots in lots of race systems, just to get rid of those micro bubbles and have them float to the top and get rid of them from a cooling system. Anyhow, just while I am here on this motor, I'll show you the same setup for the alternator. It's just an eye bolt tensioner, and we can see on this particular one, if we
rotate that, we'll see the alternator just pivot out, and that will enable us to get the belt on there and get some tension on this one. So anyhow, look, thanks for watching. As always, you know, leave some comments, questions, whatever down in the down below. Otherwise, look after yourselves until the next video. Thanks very much. Right, well, I'm getting rid of my ute, and I thought I'd just do a two-minute review for anyone who might be considering buying one. Fundamentally, it's been really good to me. The reason I'm selling it is that I bought this thing for about $75,000 about 3.5 years ago. Whether it's COVID pricing or whatever, it's now come in at about $92,000 secondhand that someone's willing to offer me, so it doesn't make sense for me to keep it. In terms of gripes with the ownership experience, it's been pretty good. I mean, the infotainment system's a bit rubbish. It was written around Pandora, which appropriately left the country 1 or 2 months after I purchased the car, which is a bit annoying. Otherwise, it's semi-reliable. Beyond that, the storage is obviously a bit of an issue. In the back, it's a bit painful to open and close the boot. But look, in terms of usability, it's not the greatest car. It's not why you buy it. The reason you buy it is because it's got a fair bit of stock. Look, what can I say? It goes pretty well. Would I buy one again? Certainly. Would I recommend it to someone else? Certainly. The only thing that you need to be aware of is that it isn't the most usable vehicle, in that, aside from fuel economy, you will be filling the thing up every second day because you only have a range of 400 to 450 clicks. Apart from that, the motor is great. LSs are great. I do wonder whether the LSA is that much better than an LS3 in the sense that these things really don't get going until they have about 4 grand on board. The gear change is quite good. You know, it does its job. The brakes are exceptionally well weighted, and it's really easy to heel and tow and sort of trail brake this car into corners and get it out of shape a bit. Aside from that, you can really just step on it anywhere and it will start to pull pretty hard. So, you know, you can have short little sharp stabs at the throttle here and you really pile on some proper speed. I'm not sure there's really much else on the road that's going to be able to be a good cruiser and be able to just tour and eat up traffic and pass anywhere, quite like something along these lines would do. At the moment, they're not great buying because of the prices that they're achieving, but there's also nothing that's really ever going to replace these. I mean, if you want something with a manual gearbox, a properly good sort of exhaust note, and the ability really just to eat up Ks and have a bit of fun whilst doing it, what else are you going to buy? So look, I've loved owning the vehicle. Day to day, it's probably not the most usable thing. You know, I can't even put my border collies in the back without removing the ridiculously large hard lid, which is a pain to store and also quite heavy to open when it is in place. What else can you say? It costs a heap for tyres. Brakes, it's actually been surprisingly good on. Other than that, really fun car. So look, could recommend it. Definitely think that these are going to be a future classic for a lot of people, there's no question. But for me, look, I've had my fun with it. Do I think that it's going to be replaced by something that's going to be maybe as equally as fun and maybe more usable day to day? Yes, but you know, you live and you enjoy these things, and I don't think they're the type of thing that I need to keep forever, but that's what it is. As we can see, she likes to break traction at anything less than sort of first gear, so I won't be too much more leery with that. But look, great car. If you do get the opportunity to own one and experience one in your life, whether it's one of these or you know, a Club Sport R8 touring car with the supercharged mill, or even just the standard LS3, you won't regret it. You'll have a good time.